Good evening, friends. It is the 29th of October at 9 p.m. I'm recovering sort of from my third surgery in the last 2.5 months. Some of you know that I've had prostate cancer, and that has led to some complications, which led to further surgeries. And anyway, right now I want to talk about something important, which is the Ram statue that is being proposed to be built by Yogi Adityanath in UP. And I think the issue here is just illustrative of the sham that is BJP and its fake propagation of the idea of pseudo-secularism. So when someone says that they oppose pseudo-secularism, you would assume that they know what is secularism and that they are promoting secularism. But what we see in this particular case is that they are promoting extreme intervention of religion in day-to-day governance. What I just want to highlight here is how backward we are in India at this point in time compared with the rest of the world. If you go back in history, we all know that there was the divine right of kings, and in India that continued for quite some time, and people, the kings were able to trace their ancestry to the sun god or whatever, some god or the other. In England, that idea of a divine right for kings was brought to an abrupt end in the 17th century, and by 1688, the Glorious Revolution, it became clear to the king that he or she was basically an appointee of the parliament. The parliament was the supreme, the people was supreme. There was no god that appointed a king. That was the end of the divine right in England. Now, when the divine right ended, you can imagine what was happening before the divine right. That is, the king and the religion. The state and the religion were both deeply intertwined. The king arrogated to himself or herself the right over religious belief, whereas he also had oversight of the government. And in this particular manner, there was complete confounding of the two jurisdictions. This was also part of the Catholic system for quite some time, with the popes and their direct control over the appointment of kings in Europe. Now, with the Glorious Revolution, it is a bloodless coup, essentially. We find that the kings no longer had that power or that capacity to dictate religion. Religion and the state started becoming separate. To formalize this particular separation, we had John Locke, who in his essays on tolerance expanded and expounded upon the idea of the separation of state and religion. And this essentially, it's not the only one, by the way. There's a long history to this particular way of thinking. We can go back to various thinkers in this regard. What we find is that John Locke's influence was dramatic and important in the history of the world, and it led to the Americans adopting his ideas, both in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution of the USA, particularly the First Amendment, which separated the two jurisdictions, in which the government was forbidden to enact any law in relation to a religion. And that, I think, is the kind of history we look at in the West. It is the most powerful and important development in the West, not just the defense of liberty, but the complete separation of the jurisdictions of the state and religion. That meant that science and technology could now flourish in the West without the government somehow stopping it on the grounds of some religious obstruction. So this is how the West became what it did. And India, being essentially a copycat country of the West at that stage, copied the 1935 India Act as part of its development of the Constitution. Now, we did not have the word secular included in that original Constitution in India, which came in after Indira Gandhi's, I think, 42nd Amendment. But the concepts of secularism were definitely part of the underpinnings of India's constitution, original constitution. Now, that, I would argue, was not done well, was inappropriately done in many cases. We had the references to the minorities, we had reference to the scheduled castes, and I can understand that there were some reasons why this might have been the case, given the history of India. And I'm not going back and criticizing the constitution because what was appropriate at that time is not something we can second guess. But what we need to note is that secularism as a concept was not formally, properly embedded in the Indian constitution, and even Indira Gandhi's attempt to include it in the preamble did not really lead to any significant change. And things like directive principles of state policy. Now, these principles, as I have elaborated at length in many places, have no bearing whatsoever with our fundamental rights and liberties. These are aspirational policies of some, not all, by the way, of some members of the Constituent Assembly. The fact that they tried their level best to get these formally included in the Constitution in some way, but they were denied by Ambedkar, who said, sorry, but these are not fundamental rights. So the compromise was the directive principles. And unfortunately, this is the only constitution in the world where policy matters are actually part of the constitution. And these policy matters, many of them are driven by religious belief. For example, things like the recommendation of the article which talks about cow slaughter, banning cow slaughter, and things of the sort. So what we and things like universal civil code and so on. So, and I'm not going to go into details of that at this stage, but what I want to notice is note at this point is that unlike in England, where there is no written constitution but an evolution has occurred by which there are no divine rights and there is a complete separation of state and religion, in India we have had a formal approach to secularism, but we never really understood it. And so as a result, we have had a continuous series of interventions by government in religion, or religious interventions by government in our day-to-day life. And this includes not only the Hindu and other various Muslim acts, but also management of temples, the Hajj subsidy, the institutions of religion that are managed by government, the Waqf boards and whatnot, and then you also have the attempts, the direct attempts to subsidize religious festivals and so on and so forth. So what we have seen in India, and I talk about the Supreme Court as an example of bad thinking in this case, where they have allowed the ancient idea of India that the gods of various temples are independent legal entities. They have allowed this to continue. Now, I understand that there needs to be some kind of a legal entity for any organization, and religion is definitely an organization, but you can't really create that as a god. You have to have it as a trust or some kind of a human creation or an entity to which there are accountable members, board members, whom you can haul up and hold to account for various failings, if any. What we have managed to do here is we have created this institution where gods are given legal rights over property, and that Supreme Court has actually been supportive of, and I really can't understand why they do this. So what we have seen here, we have seen the governments dabbling in religion, we have seen the Supreme Court not providing adequate guidance, and as a result we have now this extreme and of course we have this case of BJP doing the Ram Mandir debate and creating a complete situation where the Babri Masjid was demolished by the followers of the Hindutva groups, which is basically BJP had organized through Advani and his colleagues. So this exercise of imposing religious issues into the political sphere, dabbling and mixing the two, that has happened in India in such a big way that it doesn't really surprise a lot of people that Yogi Adityanath has talked about creating a statue of Ram. Now, I was born Hindu, and we all have great, fascination with a hero, the Ram as a hero, the Ramayana, and all the good stuff that goes along with it, Diwali and whatnot. What I really don't want to go into that as a person, because I may have different views at different points in time about a particular religion or a religious personality. What I think I want to, what we must emphasize is that Ram is not a kind of a historical figure, is not something that we have any evidence of, or has done something wonderful that we have to celebrate, apart from this so-called mythological issues that surround him as a part of a religious belief system. So the idea that we have to create a statue of Sardar Patel, that can be questioned on many grounds, in terms of prudence, in terms of the need, whether this is the right thing, but it's still a kind of a person who actually existed, and so there is some potential defense when someone says they want to make a statue of Sardar Patel. But when you start making statues of religious figures as a member of government, then I think you have crossed the line here. The Lakshman Rekha, as they say, has been crossed, and in this particular case you have gone into the sphere of dabbling with religion and using taxpayer money to support a religious belief system. Whether the issue here would be that there are many issues involved. Let's say, first of all, let's go back to BJP once again. When we talk of pseudo-secularism, is this secularism, BJP? I ask you, is this the kind of secularism you talk about, that in which there is a direct imposition of a particular religious belief on taxpayers? There are lots of taxpayers. The taxpayers who believe in a particular religion, another religion, or or have no religion. Now, why would taxpayers be forced? Taxpayers who are not believers in a particular religious, so-called God, why are they to be forced at the gunpoint, essentially, which is what all taxes are, to pay for the statue of one of these, gods of a particular religion? So it amounts to the same thing as a Hajj subsidy, which BJP has opposed, and I'm happy that the Supreme Court has finally come out against the Hajj subsidy and has argued that really even the Quran would oppose the idea of somebody else subsidizing one's Hajj visit, and they quoted the Quran in that regard. And I really don't want to go into the details of whether the Quran said this or Quran said that. The very idea of the Supreme Court has used spurious arguments, in my view, to oppose the Hajj subsidy. They should have simply said this is not the business of government. End of the story. This is the whole point of a secular country, that we cannot have a government funding a particular religion or a particular religious belief through taxes. And that I think is the basic issue involved with the Ram temple, Ram statue here. And I'm not talking the Ram temple and the kind of nuisance that is still being created by BJP in this regard. So BJP has turned out to be not it is actually not its secularism is more pseudo, let's say, than any other secularism. It is a fake secularism. BJP does not have pseudo-secularism. It has got fake secularism, where it says that you must impose Hindu gods on the people of India, but you cannot support the Hajj subsidy. Well, in my view, both of these things are fundamentally wrong. That's the purpose of the meaning of the word secularism. You cannot have either a Hajj subsidy, and you cannot have a Ram statue or a Ram temple created by government. So I think this is one of the fundamental discrepancies that Indians need to look at, and we need ultimately a clarification in the parliament, and potentially a change in the constitution, which removes all the religious laws, gets rid of all the directive principles, clarifies that there is no possibility of funding any of the religious activities by government. And in this regard, I can add that it is possible, it is quite possible and reasonable potentially to exempt religious organizations from taxes as charitable trusts, as we do that, because there is some religious institutions also do charitable activities, and so to that extent we can exempt them from taxes. That's fine, the social capital building. But to spend taxes on religious activity is complete anathema. I think that's the basic point I want to make in this video today, or the podcast today. And I think the arguments being made, there are some very spurious arguments being made about the Adityanath statue of Ram. Apparently that the statue will lead to religious tourism and therefore will create revenues for the state. But sorry, but this is the whole point. You cannot you cannot ask a government to do things that are not its business on the basis that it is making a profit. There is no profit. The government is not a profit-making entity. The government is supposed to provide governance. Its job is to be a good sweeper, a good security guard, and a good umpire. Its job is very limited. It's not an investor of our money. You cannot take my money as a believer or non-believer in a particular religion and put it in and gain and extract money out of that as revenue. You must spend money appropriately by raising it for purposes that are already agreed, which are general public goods like roads or whatever such services that are needed to be provided. So I think this is the basic point about the Yogi Adityanath Ram statue, that Mr. Yogi, Mr. Adityanath, you need to build it yourself if you are so much interested in this statue, and you need to put your own money into that. You cannot take the taxpayers' money. This is simply not on, and we oppose it. Swarn Bharat Party opposes it. I oppose it. This needs to be opposed by the whole country. This is wrong. This is like the same as the Hajj subsidy. It is the same as the various pseudo-secularism things that you've been talking about, BJP. And I'm sorry that BJP has not come out against this particular thing at the top levels of BJP with Mr. Modi and so on. But one can expect that these Hindutva fanatics will not come against this particular policy proposal. But from my side and from the side of Swarn Bharat Party, I strongly oppose this idea of Ram statue, and in fact anything to do with Ram temple. That's not the business of government to look at. That's potentially a private matter between different entities. Whether somebody wants to have a Ram temple, Ram statue, that's their own business. It's their own belief. They can spend their own money. They cannot take somebody else's money by force and spend it on their beliefs. This is where things go wrong. India has not had this history of secularism, of development of the evolution of secularism. I think it's time for us to put our foot down and say that you have crossed the Lakshman Rekha. Adityanath, go back and withdraw your statement immediately, right now. We don't want you to build a Ram statue using taxpayer money. Period. End of the story.